Thank you, guys. Okay, deep breath. I have this Christmas memory that I think about pretty often for a variety of reasons. When I was in late elementary school, early middle school, I remember this was before Christmas, in the months leading up to Christmas. I remember going to a friend's house, and I grew up in the era of Nintendo, like not Super NES, the gray rectangle Nintendo, and you'd have to blow on the cartridge when it didn't work and kind of like jam it in there different ways to make it work, that was my childhood. And loved Nintendo, and I remember going to a friend's house, and we were playing Nintendo, and he pops in this game that I had never seen before. Most of you won't know it because it's pretty obscure. It's not like Super Mario Brothers. There was a game in the early 90s called Battletoads. Does anybody know Battletoads? Oh my goodness, wow, way more people than I thought. That game was the best. So I remember playing that game at my friend's house, and I knew, like, this is it. This has to be the next 10 years of my life. I just want to do this. So I go home, and this is before the internet and stuff, but I used to get this Nintendo magazine. You guys remember the Nintendo magazine? And I remember I found Battletoads, I cut it out, and I gave the picture to my mom. And I said, Mom, Christmas is like a couple months away, and if you actually love me, like, this is it, And I was just begging her, and my mom was super non-committal. I remember this. She's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know, we'll see. And I was like, no, Mom, keep this in your purse. Every time you drive by a Toys R Us or something, may the Lord speak to you, And I shoved it into her purse every day. I remember that year leading up to Christmas, every day I would ask her, like, Mom, remember Battletoads? So Christmas morning arrives, and we had a small little tree and a few gifts under the tree, and I'm looking, and I see it. I see the box, and it's from my mom to me. And I'm like, this is it. This is the day. I can't wait. But there's a problem. I see the box, and the box is far too big to be a Nintendo video game. So I can be an optimistic person. So the first thought that crosses my mind is like, my mom loves me so much. She got me multiple games. I was like, this is the best Christmas ever. So I rip open that box, and to my utter horror and disappointment, it is a box of Frosted Flakes cereal. And there's many problems with that. One of the main problems is Frosted Flakes wasn't even a special cereal. That was the cereal we always had in our house. So I don't remember if I threw the box across the room, but I just remember feeling in my body, my 12-year-old body, I was so angry, And I just storm out of there, and my mom, she's like, open the box. I'm like, dude, I'm not hungry. I don't even know if you're my mom, this is terrible, worst Christmas ever. She's like, no, just open the box. And finally I relent. And of course, you guys know how the story's gonna end, right? I open the box, and what's inside the box? Battletoads. And it was incredible. It was awesome. Except for the part where it wasn't awesome. Now, I share that story with you because it's like a core memory for me, and it's such a sweet memory now because it wasn't a box full of actual cereal. Had it been a box full of actual cereal, I would not share this story with you. It would be trauma that lives in my body. But, here's what I know. I think my mom was just trying to be funny. But there's a really deep truth embedded in this childhood story of mine, and that truth is this, that Christmas, I think, in many ways, is this sort of long-desired gift that I think for most of us is hidden. It's tucked away in the ordinary. Christmas is this thing, whether you're a Christian or not, first of all, if you're not, we're so glad you're here. There's a reason why all of the lights and the trees and the sights and the sounds, it evokes something in us. Some of it is nostalgia and just childhood memories, but a lot of it, I think, is deeper than that. There's this long-held desire in us as human beings for hope in the midst of what feels so dark. And Christmas is that, but it is hidden. It's tucked away in cereal boxes. Like these ordinary moments all over our lives that we just kind of discard. And it's this desire, this longing inside of us that actually marks the season that begins today, Advent. We have this beautiful Advent reading. That word Advent, you may not be as familiar with that as Christmas, but Advent just comes directly from a Latin word, adventus. And the Latin word adventus, it wasn't a word that the Christians made up. Advent is this season of longing, the season of desire and anticipation. But Advent wasn't a word that the Christians made up when Jesus was born. It was at the time of Jesus' birth, the word Advent, adventus, was actually a political word in the Roman Empire. Specifically, it was political propaganda language. In the Roman Empire, whenever the emperor or the king of Rome, called the Caesar, anytime he would get ready to enter a particular town or a region, a herald would go before the Caesar and literally blow a trumpet and say, the advent or the adventus of Caesar, because the word means arrival. And it was propaganda language in the ancient Roman world as a way of saying, listen, the king of Rome is about to arrive. So you have to make plans. You've got to be ready to receive him. And after the resurrection of Jesus, the early Christians co-opt this political propaganda word, and they began to use it to declare that on the first Christmas, the birth of Christ, that had marked the true advent, the true arrival of the true King of the world. But if you know the Christmas story, and even if you don't, you know it because you've seen enough nativity scenes, or you've watched the Charlie Brown Christmas special, you know that the subversive power of Christmas is that Jesus the King does not arrive to pomp and circumstance. He does not arrive to acclaim and applause. Jesus wasn't born in a palace, and he didn't ascend an earthly throne. Jesus was born into the ordinary. But hidden, tucked away within that ordinary, was something totally other, something holy. And so this Advent season, for the next 4 weeks, you and I, as we enjoy the bright lights of this season, we are going to go on a journey called Holy Ordinary, discovering the hidden gifts of Advent. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore some of the more obscure, ordinary characters in the stories of Jesus' birth, as told to us in the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels. We're going to enter the small, unsubtle places in that story. And our hope, really, is not just that we would know more about the Christmas story, but really, truly, the hope is that as we enter the small, subtle places of the narrative, that we might discover God even in the ordinary, small, subtle places of our own lives. Now, to do this, we're loosely basing some of these teachings on a fantastic book by a dear friend of ours named A.J. Sherrill, who is a pastor out in South Carolina, who a couple of years ago wrote a book called Rediscovering Christmas. And the book is actually available to you in the Resource Center. So if you want to deep dive into some of the stories and get into more stories that we won't have time to get into in the next 4 weeks, I would highly encourage you to check out the book. The other really fun thing is AJ's actually going to be here at Westgate in a couple of Sundays. So he'll teach one of the teachings, and he's an incredible teacher. So I can't wait. Now, today, as we begin this journey, I actually want to begin the journey by exploring a character who doesn't exist. There's a character in our sort of Christmas imagination that many of us have come to believe is this important person in the Christmas story, but he doesn't actually exist. So let me explain. I'll show you a painting here. This is called Joseph Seeks Lodging in Bethlehem. It's by a late 19th century French painter named James Tissot. Now, I want you to, there's a lot happening in this painting. It's quite busy. But I want you to notice in the upper left-hand corner at the top of the steps, do you see that guy? He's the innkeeper. And if you could see the image more closely, you would see sort of on his face this sort of negative scowl. He's dismissive, and he's basically kind of waving his arms like, no, no. That's kind of his motion. And essentially, he is refusing lodging to Joseph and Mary, the earthly parents of Jesus. Now, these sorts of depictions of an innkeeper refusing lodging to Joseph and Mary, they began about 500 years ago. I'll show you one of the earliest examples. This next image is it's a Flemish painting dated to the late 1400s, and it's called The Arrival in Bethlehem. And you see Joseph there in the sort of red, pink garb, and you see Mary in the blue. But to the right, you see another pregnant woman who is with child, and she's the innkeeper in this painting. And she's basically looking at Joseph and Mary, being like, no vacancy. Now, these sorts of depictions of an innkeeper that refuses lodging to Joseph and Mary, they're everywhere in the last 400 or 500 years, all over art depicting the Christmas story. And listen, I grew up hearing this story. I grew up hearing that Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem and Mary needed to give birth to Jesus, but there was no room for them in the inn. Anybody else hear that? Like, I heard that a lot. And then we just assumed, like, oh yeah, because the innkeeper didn't realize this is Christ. And you gotta make room. He was cold and callous and dismissive. So I grew up like sort of despising this innkeeper. What was so interesting is there is no innkeeper in the story. Let me read it to you. Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus, that's the emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone, like all citizens of the empire, went to their own town or their hometown where they or their family were from to register for the census. So Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee, where he lived, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. This is the baby Jesus. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. So now Mary is like having contractions, right? Jesus is ready to enter the world. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. This is Jesus. And she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. So these three words in English, no guest room, these three words are the only words in the entire Bible from which people depict this innkeeper that refuses to give lodging to Joseph and Mary. It's just these three words. That's where 500 years of tradition, my childhood, of hating this innkeeper who didn't let Jesus' parents in, like that all came from these three words. For centuries, people have believed in this dismissive, callous innkeeper character based on this single line. Now, let me explain. Just let's get a little bit technical, and this will all go somewhere. In the Greek, the original language of most of the New Testament, in the Greek, there is a specific word for the English word inn, or like motel or hotel. There is a word. It's the Greek word pandohion. You don't have to remember that. But the Greek word pandohion is the word for inn or motel. Now, Luke, who is the biographer of Jesus in the text that I just read to you, Luke does use the word pandohion, inn or motel. He uses that word, but he does not use it here. He uses that word like 8 chapters later in the Good Samaritan story. You guys remember the Good Samaritan story? There's this injured man on the side of the road, and the Good Samaritan comes, and he cares for the injured man, and the story goes like this, that the Good Samaritan takes the injured man, and he takes him to a pandohion, an inn or a motel. And what he does is he pays the innkeeper. He says, let me give you money, and you just give him a room and take care of him while I go away and then come back. That's the word, pandohion, inn, motel. Luke knows the word, he uses the word. But in the story I just read to you, in the Christmas story, he doesn't use pandohion. Guest room is not inn or motel. The word he uses here to describe guest room is the Greek word kataluma. You don't have to remember that either, but here's why it's important. Kataluma was a Greek word that described not a room that was vacant at a motel. Kataluma describes a room that exists within a residence. Let me explain. I'll show you an image here. And this is, archaeologists have discovered that this is the way first century homes in Bethlehem, almost all of them, were laid out the same way. They were essentially laid out this way. So I know there's 2 doors at the bottom, but I want you to pay attention to the door on the bottom left. You see that bottom left door? That door was the main entrance to the home. And almost every home in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth was laid out this way. You would enter the main entrance of the home, bottom left there, and directly in front of you, you would see an animal room or a small stable. This is where the family would keep their livestock, their animals. But immediately to the right upon entering, you would see a few steps, not like a long staircase, but like 3 or 4 steps. And you would walk up those 3 or 4 steps to an elevated room. And that elevated room was what was called the family room. Now, in the first century Jewish world, in Bethlehem, they originated the open floor plan, which everyone pays millions for now, But they did it out of necessity. They didn't have money to build multiple bedrooms. Land was really small. So this family room was typically about the size of your average bedroom today. So it's a small little room, but the family room is actually literally where everything in the family life happened. Families would live in this family room. They would eat there together. They would sleep there together. Literally all of life took place in the family room. Now, you see in that family room a small manger. A manger is a feeding trough for animals. In most family rooms, archaeologists have found, there would also be a manger in the family room. The reason this was so is because most evenings in this part of the world got fairly cold. And what they would do is the family would typically, on most nights, take 1 or 2 of the most vulnerable animals amongst their livestock. They would have those animals enter the family room and stay in the family room with the family. They did this for 2 reasons. 1, it was to protect the vulnerable animals from the cold. And 2, it was a sort of first century heating system. The body heat from these small animals would heat up the family room so that the family could sleep sort of in slightly warmer climate. And because these animals would sleep in the family room on most nights, most families would have a manger or a feeding trough. Now, if you look to the right of the image, you see a guest room. Archaeologists have found that most first century Bethlehem homes had a guest room. Either the family would build a guest home, literally the way you see it here, on the side of the main room, or more commonly, they would build a guest room on the roof of the family room. Now, guest rooms were built because in Jewish culture, to take in strangers, to be hospitable to those in need was a big deal. They would also build guest rooms because sometimes family would come to visit, and there wasn't enough space in the family room. So when family came to visit, they would stay in the guest room, typically on the roof of the house. What does all of this mean? It is highly unlikely that Joseph and Mary went looking for a Motel 6 but couldn't find vacancies. There is no indication of an inn nor an innkeeper. Luke had those concepts within his worldview. He mentions them later in the story, but he does not mention inns here. Instead, he uses a word that was about a particular residential space, the guest room. Because of this, now, today, most biblical scholars believe, this is the overwhelming consensus now, most biblical scholars agree that Joseph and Mary went to the home of one of Joseph's relatives. Because of the census, though, everybody was returning home, right? So this relative of Joseph had a guest room, a kataluma. But that guest room was already full. Why? Because a bunch of relatives were in town to take the census. And so what does Joseph's unnamed relative decide to do? He or she does not tell Joseph and Mary, sorry, there's no room, sleep out on the streets. What does this unnamed relative do? The unnamed relative says, there is no room in the guest room, so come stay with us in the family room. Like literally, where I live, there's very little space, and I'm sorry, but stay here. This is why there's so little space. Joseph and Mary enter the family room, and they cozy up in the corner next to the animals by the manger. And in that dingy feeding trough, surrounded by a hospitable family, in the warmth of that space, Christ enters the world. The Christmas story is not the story of a dismissive, callous innkeeper. It is the story of an unnamed relative who offers radical welcome through the ordinary, small, subtle act of providing shelter for Joseph and Mary. But listen, this ordinary act of extraordinary hospitality came with great risk. Remember, Mary is pregnant, right? But she is pregnant before her marriage to Joseph had been finalized. Now, in that world, this sounds barbaric, but in that world, this meant that Mary was considered religiously and ceremonially unclean by Jewish standards. And in fact, according to Jewish law at the time, Mary, being pregnant before her marriage was finalized, meant that Mary was potentially, she could be executed for such a crime. I know that sounds barbaric, but that is the first century world. And all of that means that this unnamed relative's act of ordinary kindness and hospitality was risky. You know, these next few thoughts are not in the Bible, so this isn't like biblical truth. It's just my own wondering. It's my own conjecture. But I think there's a good chance that Jesus, like not the Jesus we read about as a Jewish rabbi in the Gospels, but the 30 years we don't read about when he was a child growing up into adulthood. I wonder if Jesus was told by his mother Mary this story. My guess is he was told many times this story. Like you can imagine Mary telling the little boy Jesus, son, when you were born, I just have to tell you. First of all, it was crazy. An angel told me you were going to be born. But beyond that even, we went to Bethlehem. There was this census, and son, we had nowhere to stay. We went to your dad's relative's place, but they didn't have any room. I had no idea how I was going to bring you into the world, but Uncle so-and-so or Aunt so-and-so welcomed us in. They welcomed us in, not into the guest room, but into literally their family room. And I do wonder if Jesus had his own story in mind, the story of his earthly parents being welcomed in by ordinary, subtle, small, risky, radical welcome. I wonder if he thought about that story every time he sat at a table with tax collectors and sinners. Last week, Ruth taught beautifully on the table and how Jesus sits with people he was never supposed to sit with. And every time he did that, I wonder if Jesus, in the back of his mind, thought like, man, my family did that for my parents. And that's in large part one of the reasons why I'm here. I wonder if Jesus had his own story in mind when he risked radical welcome by reaching out and touching the unclean or the sick or the blind or the lepers. Every time he invited children who were considered totally worthless at the time to draw near to him. I wonder if he had his own story in mind when he declared, I was a stranger, but you invited me in, or when he defended the sinful woman who anointed him, or initiated conversation with the Samaritan woman living in sin. I wonder if he thought of his parents' story when he invited the outcast Zacchaeus to have dinner with him. I wonder sometimes if Jesus thinks from his throne in heaven about when his parents were welcomed in, when he radically welcomed me into his family many years ago. I wonder if he thinks about his own story every time he radically welcomes me back when I confess and repent of my own brokenness and sin and return to him. The Apostle Paul in Romans 15 says, welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Peter says in 1 Peter 4, offer hospitality to one another. The writer Eugene Peterson describes it this way. He says, hospitality is the practice of welcoming the stranger, receiving the other, just as God in Christ has welcomed us. You know, this time of year, there's a lot of talk about Christmas spirit, right? by which most people mean like a temporary seasonal increase in niceness. And we're like spurred on and inspired by, Mariah Carey ballads and twinkling lights. And culture's like, okay, I can do it. All I want for Christmas is you, or whatever. And we just kind of half-heartedly commit to being a little nicer to each other for a few weeks. That's culturally Christmas spirit, right? And then January comes, and you're just back to honking your horn because someone cut you off, whatever. For the Christian, Christmas spirit can be better understood as the Spirit of Christ at work in us. And this work happens before, during, and after the holiday season. The Spirit of Christ at work in us at all times. And of the many things that the Spirit of Christ does in us, one of the things he does is provoke us toward radical welcome. And radical welcome, when it is made practical, means making room. Again, this is what Ruth talked about last Sunday. It means making room even when there doesn't seem to be much room. Listen, Joseph's unnamed relative did not actually have room. I can guarantee you that, because the size of family rooms in first century Bethlehem were small. And there was a census happening, and that house was already full. And yet, Joseph's unnamed relative, a relative you and I don't know, we'll never know, we don't know who this person was, makes room, and the extraordinary happens. The Savior of the world enters the human story through the radical welcome of this family in an ordinary, small, subtle way. This is our invitation, to be a people of radical welcome, not by doing something spectacular, just in ordinary, small, subtle ways. I'm going to invite Chris and the team to come back up. We're going to sing together here and respond in a moment. Before we do, I thought I would offer you like 4 questions to ask yourself this week to consider if God, by his Spirit, might be provoking you toward offering radical welcome and hospitality in ordinary ways. So a few questions to ask yourself. And this is not like a guilt trip, please go do all 4 of these things. You don't have to do anything. It's your choice. I just want to offer these questions as practices. Practice asking yourself these questions this week. And just if you sense God asking you to radically welcome someone in an ordinary way, would you have the courage to say yes? So first, is God asking you to make room in your home? Like literally to make room in your actual home. Maybe even as I say that, there might be a few of us in this room, someone just came to mind. A widow in your neighborhood who you know is going to spend Christmas alone. Or a coworker whose family lives on the other side of the planet and they're just going to spend Christmas alone. And it's inconvenient, honestly. It's like, it can get awkward. You invite someone who's not really family to spend Christmas in your home. It's like, do I really want to do that? You don't have to, but maybe there's a few of us here right now, someone just came to mind. Is it worth paying attention? Is God possibly asking you, hey, invite that person over for Christmas? They might say no, but just have the courage to invite them. Hey, do you want to come to our family for Christmas? Or maybe for some of us, is God asking you to make room in your schedule? I really struggle to live an interruptible life. I'm the sort of person who lives and dies by my calendar and my schedule. And I can be a little like OCD with that kind of stuff. And I really struggle with this. But when I think about my own life, the moments when God has moved most emphatically and powerfully to bring healing and wholeness into my life, almost every single time, it's been through another person in my life who had plenty of other things to do, but for some reason decided to allow my brokenness to interrupt their life. With a conversation, a coffee, a lunch, a phone call. So is God asking you to make room in your schedule? I know the holidays are really busy. I know that they are. But is there a coworker who you know is really struggling? Or a neighbor that for whatever reason, like God just keeps bringing them to mind. Or it's not even they come to mind all the time. It's just you always, unplanned, you always take your trash out to the curb and they're always doing the same. Like, what is that? Am I supposed to say more than just a hello? Is God asking you to make room in your schedule? For some of us, the question we should ask is God asking you to make room in your heart? Some of us have closed doors to our hearts, to specific people. Not always, but most of the time, this question has to do with the people who are actually nearest and sometimes dearest to us. A family member who there's been a rupture in the relationship, or a close friend, or a coworker or a colleague, or a spouse or a child. And is God asking you to make room in your heart, to open that door again, to empathize, to hold a generous assumption? Or is God asking you to help us make room here in our church? That might be as simple as inviting someone to Christmas Eve. Man, you're going to come and light candles on Christmas Eve, and it's going to be beautiful and lovely. But do you know someone who might also find it beautiful and lovely, and maybe healing and restorative, that might not otherwise go to a church Christmas Eve service unless maybe you invite them? But it's not about going to a service alone. It's like anything. We talk about Alpha a lot here. And in the next year, you're going to hear us talk about it a bit more. This really sacred space. Ruth talked about it last Sunday. This sacred space where people who are like on the fence or have a lot of questions or they're just spiritually seeking or whatever, like safe space for them to bring their questions. Maybe God is asking you, make room by inviting someone in your life who's spiritually curious or in a crisis to go to Alpha with you for a few weeks. Just check it out. So how is God asking you to make room in your life? It's like a little over 8 years ago, my daughter Harper was not yet 3. She was like 2.5 or something. And after a long, a couple of years of like maternity break, Jenny was getting ready to go back to work. We're a dual income family. And so we started having conversations with our little 2.5-year-old about going to school, like preschool. And we started researching all these preschools and doing visits, and we would take her on the visits to see what fit her. And, she was 2.5, and her entire life had been just home, surrounded by family, mom, dad, grandma, uncles, and aunts. That was it. That was her whole life. She was only surrounded by people she knew and loved, and she knew loved her. And now all of a sudden, and we're like blowing her 2.5-year-old mind by saying, now you're going to spend most of your days with a bunch of strangers. She's like racked with anxiety and lots of tears, but we're trying to help her understand. Eventually, we pick a school, and we love the school. It's a beautiful school, small little preschool. And we're just pumping her up. We're like, come on, Harper, you can do it. You're going to make such good friends. But she just will not have it. And I have this very vivid memory. I remember that first day, putting her in the car seat. I had to do drop-off and pick up that day. And I put her in the car seat, and she's already crying. And we're driving to school, and I'm just and the whole drive, I'm just like second-guessing myself. It's like, should we do this? Maybe I should just not work and be a stay-at-home dad. This is so hard, But we know this is the right thing, so we finally get to the school. And I remember that day, the school had intentionally told us, hey, come about 30 minutes later than the normal start time to school. Come about 30 minutes late. I didn't quite know why, but I said, okay. So we get to school that day about half an hour late, and man, she's clinging to me so tightly, and she's fighting so hard to not go in. But I finally convinced her to go in. She's wiping the tears from her eyes. She's like racked with fear and anxiety. And we walk into the classroom, and instead of just like this chaotic classroom full of little 3-year-olds running around doing their stuff, I peek into the classroom, and they're already in circle time. You know circle time, when kids sit in a circle on the floor and the teacher like reads a book or whatever? They're already in circle time, and they're waiting. And the moment we walk in the door, the teacher, with the warmest smile on her face, looks at my daughter, and she says, "Hi, Harper. We have a spot just for you." And I look at the circle, and I realize there's one spot literally open, and these 2 sweet little kids sitting next to that spot, I think they'd been coached, but they're like patting the floor. Like, "Come here. My teacher told me to say this to you. Come." And I never show you pictures of my kids, but I got permission from my family to show you this one. I snapped this photo. And this picture is so meaningful to me. Like, I was fighting back so many tears when I snapped this photo. This is the moment she sat down. You cannot see her face, but there is so much fear and anxiety in my little girl here. But I knew she's going to be okay, because they made room for her. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, he says the church's first task is to be a community of welcome, because God in Christ has welcomed us. As the people of God who have been welcomed to a table we did not deserve to sit at, can you and I be the sorts of people remembering Christ, our King, who has welcomed us? Can we be the sorts of men and women who say to a lost and lonely, isolated world, "We have a spot just for you"? This is how we honor Christ, our King, who said to us, "I have a spot just for you." So in light of that, let's stand and sing and respond together.